So we'll start with that new poll, Joe, that again shows a majority of Americans support House Democrats' impeachment inquiry into President Trump. According to this new NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll, 52% of Americans said they approve of House Democrats' impeachment inquiry into the president. That's up 3 points since last month. 43% disapproved. 49% said they support the impeachment of the president. 47% are opposed. Americans in this poll are divided 48 to 48 on whether they support the Senate voting to remove Trump from office. 68% of Americans said that it's not acceptable for a president to ask foreign countries to investigate his political rivals. 26% disagreed. And Joe, you know, that's the question that I think the White House perhaps thought they would have a very easy time conflating this, confusing this, muddying it up, and making it too hard for people to understand. The answer to this question is basic. The answer is no. It's not okay to shake down Ukraine for dirt on your political rival. Americans know that.
Right, Americans know that instinctively. They certainly know that about China as well. It's very interesting when the president actually asked China to help out, to look into this. You had some members of Congress and some Trumpists in the Trump supportive media saying it was just a joke. Well, the president was asked again yesterday whether he was joking or not, and he brushed it off and said, well, if China wants to investigate, that's what they should do. It's up to China on whether. So it's not a joke whether the president is asking China in front of a bank of cameras to investigate Joe Biden and his family, or whether he's actually going through back channels to do it and then admitting it. So they understand that instinctively. And in most polls, 2 out of 3 Americans say it is wrong, which is what makes Cory Gardner's bumbling and babbling around and Joni Ernst's bumbling around at press conferences, what makes that so depressing. It's wrong. Mitt Romney has it right. That is beneath the dignity of the President of the United States. And like you said, Americans get it. They're on to it.
Yeah.
And Jake Sherman, when you get a series of polls over the past several days, one, a Fox News poll saying 51% of Americans support his removal from office. At this point, the White House is getting worried, and Republican senators on the Hill have to be starting to think a little. Their focus, at least, is more narrowed in on this. What can you tell us? What are you hearing from the Hill, from Republicans?
There's definitely a sense of concern among Republicans, and you see that. And the most telling thing is nobody is coming out to defend the president, right? You don't see a parade of Republican lawmakers running to cameras in their districts saying, but Donald Trump, and here's why he's right, and here's why he did nothing wrong. You see Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan, who will never have to deal with any electoral consequence because they have districts that suit them and that are completely safe, and they go on camera to defend the president constantly. And I think the thing that troubles people the most is they don't know where the bottom is here. They don't know what the end of the story is. They don't know how much the people around the president have done. And frankly, the White House is not giving them any signals. Their entire strategy here is to pretend this impeachment inquiry doesn't really exist and it's not on the level. And that's scary. I will say one thing interesting. House Republicans, if you talk to them, they are polling more narrow slices of the electorate, basically seats they hold and seats they'd like to hold, where they say they're in the right on impeachment and the American people don't want impeachment. So you see this kind of stark divide that's becoming more and more clear around the country. But House Republicans see this very different than the Senate Republicans. Obviously, senators have to represent an entire state, and House Republicans are increasingly representing Trump-centric districts that support the president no matter what he says or does.
Hey, Jake, we saw a performance from Senator Cory Gardner back in his home state of Denver yesterday, where for about 4 minutes he was asked the very basic question, is it appropriate for a president to accept foreign influence in our elections, in our political process? Wouldn't answer the question, pivoted to Nancy Pelosi and the investigation being political. How much longer are guys like him and Ron Johnson and others going to be able to take that basic question, not provide a yes or no no answer and get away with it. Is that going to be the strategy until the end of time? They're just going to hope this goes away somehow? And does that change at all as we watch this polling now move into majorities of Americans saying that they want to see at least the impeachment inquiry, and in many cases see President Trump removed from office based on what they know just publicly?
Well, Gardner is a special case, obviously, because he represents a state that is both urban, suburban, and rural in a major and kind of drastic and stark way, whereas a lot of other senators do not. So Gardner is somebody that's going to have a really tough time here. Something that I found actually really interesting yesterday, which we need to keep an eye on, is when Joni Ernst appeared next to Mike Pence, and literally every question that Mike Pence got asked, standing next to Joni Ernst, an endangered Republican senator, was about the impeachment inquiry. How long are Republicans going to want to stand next to members of this administration when every single question is about ballooning scandals? Remember, this scandal is not becoming more narrow in scope. It's becoming wider in scope and more encompassing of more facets of this administration. So as we get to 2020, who's going to want to stand next to Pence and Donald Trump when they're trying to seek re-election? I think what Cory Gardner did yesterday, I don't know how he was not prepared to answer that question. Remember, this is somebody who chaired the Republican Senatorial Committee last cycle. This is somebody who's supposed to understand Senate politics and how to answer questions. But this is the playbook for a lot of Republicans. It is simply to turn this around, talk about the overt political nature of the process, and then pivot to somebody else. And again, I think you're right, Willie. It's not going to last.
Rev, I want to ask you a question. Steve, I'd like you to jump in. You know, it's so interesting when you see these polls now, and to Jake's point that a lot of Republicans are being quiet. For the first time, I spoke to a serious Trump guy who, no matter what happened, was always like, nope. For the first time, he said, well, things aren't working so well. It wasn't even an issue about the investigation. It was about the economy. All of a sudden, whether it's trade, whether it's the inverted yield curve, I'm starting to see people, and these are the people that once again have stood by him, not as much even about the investigation, but they're starting to sense that other than the unemployment numbers, the economy is going the other direction. People get a lot braver when the economy is not going well.
With the economy headed the way it is and other promises that he made not there, I think the Democrats are right to focus on the investigations. But they need to focus on where's the wall, how is it being paid for, the little part that's going, what happened to infrastructure. I think a lot of people that are for Trump or have been for Trump are waking up realizing this guy has not delivered on what he promised us. And then when you have in the investigation, the majority of Americans saying overwhelmingly that a foreign government should not interfere with our elections, all left for the Congress to do is to prove that they did. If he did it, they've already had a jury that says we will go against him. Just give us the evidence. It cannot be a good time in the White House because it all is moving the other way now.
You know, it's interesting. I had a friend reach out to me who's a traditional Republican and said he wants to have coffee next week because he cannot any longer support this administration. What do you do? So, yeah, I agree with it. I think they're moving away from Trump for a couple of reasons. One, they got some of the policies they wanted early, but now they're getting policies they don't like the trade war. But secondly, most people are stand-up moral people, and they look at Trump and they look at the way he conducts himself, and they say to themselves, how can I support a guy who's utterly immoral, corrupt probably, and is surrounded certainly by corrupt people? The problem they have is where do they go? Because
the next thing they go, but I can't vote for Elizabeth Warren.
That is the next, exactly. That is the next thing that they say is I can't vote for Elizabeth Warren. Biden's got his issues. We can go through the list. And so the problem, they're like the never Trumpers. They're people without a home, without a country, because they can't stand him, but they really don't see a Democrat who's going to get there who they can support. If we had a moderate Democrat
I've heard
in
that a
the
lot.
mix,
Absolutely.
They would all go to it.
That's exactly right. By the way, they find
all
immorality when their pocketbook starts getting affected. It's very interesting.
So Mika, you and I have heard this repeatedly from so many people, not only on former Trump supporters, but independents and Democrats. And I mean, and it's really from all sides of the party where they say, we can't vote for Donald Trump, but gee, we can't vote for Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders either. And therein lies, I think, a real challenge. I know, Twitter will explode if you ever make that argument on Twitter. I'm just telling people that are watching the show what we all hear. And it's from different groups. It's not just in New York.
It's from
it's
Democrats,
in Florida.
Joe.
It's in Michigan. No, it's all from, it's Democrats
Suburbs.
as well who are really scared right now. In the suburbs, people in the suburbs where this is Democratic territory. If what we are hearing is actually true, then Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, either one of them against Donald Trump, puts the suburbs back in play.
I stood alone. I stood alone. I think I felt in the conversation leading up in the run-up to the election about the weaknesses of Hillary Clinton's campaign. But now when I talk to people who are high up in the Democratic Party, this conversation is real. There is a void. There is a problem about who can beat Trump. I personally love Elizabeth Warren. You all know that. You've been watching me watch her for years. I think her message matches her life story, matches what she wants to do for America. I would potentially vote for her. But you know what? The people who are really tired of Trump, who are looking for an alternative, who would be very comfortable with Joe Biden, they're left without a candidate if Joe Biden can't make it through.
I hear from everybody.
This is what I hear.
The issue is not just policy. What I'm hearing the exact same thing that Joe and you are expressing. It's a question of leadership. We have a president that has indicated, I will bring down the whole American experiment for my own self-aggrandizement and self-interest. People want someone that's strong, that will not only come with the right policy, and I think Elizabeth Warren and Bernie and them are doing that, but that show the strength to hold this nation up on its back and stand up. And that strength is going to be just as important as policy, because we're dealing with
Let me challenge you on
Trump.
policy. Americans don't want, 160 million Americans don't want to be told they can't get the insurance they want. Literally, Elizabeth Warren, and I take a lot of heat from this, and she's wonderful, is the only thing that I think can keep Trump in office.
Yeah, no. Look,
Well, the problem right now is, Willie, that you also talk to the same Democrats who are expressing real concern about Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. They're expressing equal concern, and I'd love to hear from Steve and others about this, about Joe Biden, who, let's just say it on the air, they don't think Joe Biden is up for this race. They don't think he can do it. And that is, again, you know, we heard all of these complaints about Hillary Clinton's campaign, but nobody in polite society would really say it on television. Mika said it, and everybody was shocked and stunned and deeply saddened. And Phil Griffin would get calls from people running the Democratic Party saying that Mika had to straighten up or be taken off the air. Mika ended up being right about that. So let's just get it out on the table now instead of waiting until next year. We're all hearing that Joe Biden just may not be up to this. That's why Democrats are really wringing their hands behind the scenes, saying, my God, are we going to get Donald Trump again?
You do hear that, and yet his polling has, listen, he's held his position.
Yes, he has.
But Elizabeth Warren is surging. That's why the race is getting closer. You hear that anecdotally. You hear it after the debates, certainly, where they go, boy, I don't know. Can he hang in with Donald Trump in a one-on-one matchup? I'm watching him. He doesn't look like he's got his fastball anymore. Of course you hear all those things. But in polling, public polling, he's still doing well, and he's still in a tight race with Elizabeth Warren. I think also, yes, I hear that some of the Democrats that Donnie and Steve talked to say, I don't want my taxes to go up with Elizabeth Warren. I also hear from Democrats who are so principally against Donald Trump that they say, I'll take anybody but Donald Trump. So yes, maybe I would prefer Joe Biden, but I can live with Elizabeth Warren because, by the way, I don't think Medicare for All is ever going to pass through the Senate anyway. That's what they might say. Yeah. By the way, none of these things that scare you so much that she's putting out there are ever going to make it through the United States Senate. That's not me saying it. Claire McCaskill says it on the air, saying, yes, you may object to a lot of it, but it's not going to happen anyway.
Well, look, I was at a dinner the other night.
I was just going to say, Steve, I was just going to say, Steve, that is the case. It will never happen. Medicare for All will certainly not happen in this environment. You go back and look at Obamacare and how difficult Obamacare was to pass. Just barely got through. Democrats paid for it for 8 years politically. So if somebody, I mean, again, this is just a reality check. If somebody's looking at Elizabeth Warren and looking at Medicare for All, they have to understand it's not going to pass the House, and if it does pass the House, it will never pass the United States Senate. But, Steve, people don't think that way when they go in to vote. They just go, Elizabeth Warren's taking wants to take my private health care plan away from me and make me go to the federal government to get health care. That is not a winning issue when you drill down in it in the polls.
No, look, I think you're exactly right. But I would say people don't think about it that way. But look, I was at a political dinner the other night, and someone said, well, I don't agree with Elizabeth Warren about anything, but I'm going to vote for her because nothing she wants is actually going to get passed. That's kind of a crazy way to make a political decision and run a country. So I think the issues, look, there's one issue, which is, can Elizabeth Warren beat Donald Trump? And we can all debate that. I would say in the world I live in, of people who don't like Trump, don't want to vote for Trump, they have a real hard time bringing themselves to vote for Elizabeth Warren. And then secondly is the question that she does have a lot of policies, not all of which have to go through Congress, some of which can be done administratively, that I personally think, at least from an economic perspective, would be highly negative. But you do have, I agree with what you said a few minutes ago, you do have the situation where Democrats are worried about winning because of the strengths and weaknesses of the various leading candidates, and the people in the center who really don't like Trump, don't want to vote for Trump, are looking at what's going on the Democratic side and say, who do I vote for? Where do I go?
Yeah. Well, and you look, Rev, also, let's just show all sides of this. You look at just about every head-to-head matchup. And yes, Joe Biden wins by double digits. It trounces Donald Trump. In this one, he wins by 10 points, and others, it's even more than that. But look at Elizabeth Warren. In this poll, she's winning by 10 points. Bernie's winning by 9 points. This is, of course, I guess the concern is these numbers will all tighten up. They always do tighten up. And perhaps Biden might play better in Pennsylvania, might play better in Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio. But Rev, we've talked about Elizabeth Warren's weaknesses. You look at this poll and suggest, well, maybe she's not so weak with swing voters. But then let's go to Joe Biden, too, who we've all said people are concerned that he's lost more than one step and he's not up to it. And yet, Rev, you look at Fox News poll we just showed, he's up 3 points. He's up 3. He's ahead of the field. And you look at that South Carolina poll, where it counts the most. And Biden, man, he is tearing them up in South Carolina.
A lot of Biden's support in South Carolina is African-American voters, and a lot of that is based on he was Barack Obama's vice president. If there is an upset in Iowa, or even a close vote in New Hampshire, and it appears that Elizabeth Warren is the one that can beat Donald Trump, a lot of that vote will switch because a lot of the pro-Biden vote or the pro any of the Democrats votes are based on anti-Trump. People, particularly in the world I live in, would vote for anyone against Trump. The question is, can we come up with somebody that will beat Trump rather than just anybody? An anti-Trump vote is one thing. A anti-vote because I like this person is another thing. But let's not forget Elizabeth Warren wasn't even in the discussion a few months ago.
That's right.
So she's come from someone who everyone was laughing at in the Pocahontas thing to where everybody's discussing, can she beat Trump? That's a long way from where she started. I would not count her out.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.